Good morning. Apologies from us for the minor delay getting in. We had some minor technical difficulties, but we're back on track now. I am now going to switch over to share my PowerPoint screen with you. And there you go. Everybody should see my PowerPoint screen now. So yeah, so as a result of the feedback from the first 3 sessions, some of the things that came out, people were looking for more information about how do I know how I'm doing? And the other questions were around what happens in an inspection by the regulator. So how does that work? So we'll cover some of that today. Again, you've got a chat button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to click on the chat button and type in any questions you have as we go along, and Nicole will jump in and stop me, and she'll be monitoring the questions, and she'll jump in and stop me if we have any questions, or we'll catch them at the end, one or the other. So, all right. So first thing, I guess, is how are we doing? So what kind of things should we look at to give ourselves a bit of a measuring stick to tell how we're doing with compliance within occupational health and safety? So we talked about the Act and things the other day, but one of the things is, one of the first things is that once you have 5 or more employees regularly employed, and again, regularly employed means a reoccurring period of employment 4 weeks or greater in the run of a year. So that includes our seasonal employees and things like that go into that count of regularly employed. That's important to recognize, particularly in this industry where we can be quite seasonal by nature. So when you have 5 or more employees, you're required to have a policy. When you have 20 or more regularly employed, again, same definition, you're required to have a written program. You're also required to have and I apologize for the acronym, a Joint Occupational Health and Safety Committee, JOSH. We refer to it as JOSH for short, but a safety committee. You're required to do certain communications are required. You're required to provide training for people, and you're required to make sure that we have our hazards identified and controlled within our workplaces. So let's kind of go through these kind of one step at a time. So for a policy, again, 5 or more regularly employed. Again, that means a recurring period of 4 weeks or greater. So even if somebody's only working 5, you only have summer students or seasonals for 5 or 6 weeks of the year, they go towards that count of total employees. So the policy is generally a 1-pager. Sometimes it's a 2-pager that basically the Act says it has to include the employers, the reason the employer is committed to health and safety, the commitment to cooperate with employees towards health and safety initiatives, and the responsibilities of the parties within the workplace with regards to health and safety. So those are the 3 minimum things that have to be within our policies. It can have more than that. It just can't have less than that. It has to have those minimum 3 things included. We move, once you hit that magical 20 employees regularly employed, and again, those include those seasonals and part-times and owners and so on. Those are all included in your total numbers. Once you hit that 20 plus regularly employed, then you have to have a safety program. So this is a documented binder as such, with a whole bunch of different things in it around. Essentially, it's the rule book. It's the guideline for us to what we're going to do to prevent injury and illness in our workplaces. So the things that are laid out in the Act as minimum requirements are a requirement to have a way to identify training needs and supervision, to have safe work procedures in place, to provide a safety committee or a representative. So I should back up. because remember I said 5+ have to have a policy. From 5 to 19 employees must have a representative. So that's sort of a one-person safety committee, for lack of a better description. It's a single employee representative, not a management, not a supervisory person. Has to be an employee representative that is the go-to person for any staff members that have any questions, concerns. They can filter them through that individual should they decide to. So they kind of become a little bit of a one-person safety committee. Once you hit 20, you have to have an actual safety committee. So the safety committee has to be established. It's the employer's obligation to establish the committee. Once the committee is established, there's certain things that they have to do. They, that are all outlined in the Act, what they're expected to do. Essentially, what their overall intent is it's set up to be a system to provide for like a cooperative decision-making collaboration within our workplaces around health and safety. So the committee is made up of employee members and management members. And it is sort of the oversight to make sure that our programs are running the way they should be, and provide some assistance with that. There's also a requirement to have a hazard identification system, and they outline a little bit of what they try to give you a little bit of guidance around what a hazard identification system is. But basically, it's a way to identify our hazards in the workplace, whether that be through inspections, through various other types of monitoring, to identify hazards and put corrective actions in place to manage the risk around those hazards. We talked about hazard and risk in one of the other previous sessions. So the idea is to identify all the hazards, assess the risks, and put controls in place and monitor how effective those controls are. And in fact, that's one of the next bullets in the requirements for a program, is to have a system to monitor and follow up on how our hazards are working out. Like how are we managing those risks? Has it been effective? Are we continuing to have incidents occurring? And so on and so forth. We're obligated to investigate any incidents that do occur within our workplace, and again, with the intent of prevention of reoccurrence. That's the goal. The goal is to prevent reoccurrence. It's not to find fault, it's to prevent reoccurrence. We're required to, our program must include a way to provide records and statistics. So how many incidents have occurred in the last year, how many inspections were completed, how many safety committee meetings were held, are there minutes for those meetings recorded, and so on and so forth. And it also has to have a way to monitor the overall effectiveness of the program. So how is it working? How do we know that things are getting better, that we're maintaining a safe workplace, we're not putting people in harm's way? So again, there's a variety of different ways you can do that. We'll talk about as we go along. So communications, there's certain communications that are required. So the Act requires us to post certain information on and they say post, meaning they have to be readily available for people within the workplace. So that quite commonly is like a bulletin board, where we have a bulletin board where we post a whole bunch of information in a common place where all the employees go, whether that's a staff room or a common area or something like that, that we post information. That posted information, there's a list of things, and I will send you a link with a list of the things that have to be included in that posted information. But posted information includes things like the names and contact information for your safety committee members or your safety rep if you have one. It includes things like a copy of the Act, the OHS Act of Nova Scotia, an up-to-date copy being posted and available for people to see and be able to read things. The regulations that apply to your workplace must be available. They don't necessarily have to be posted. So you could have a link, for instance, to them perhaps, or a means for people to get to them, or you could actually print them and post them. You have to have the phone number to the Department of Labor posted. So that is the 1-800-9-LABOUR, LABOUR number. That's so that if an employee, and again, the intention is that an employee has a concern or something, that they have access to a number, they can call that hotline. That's a 24-hour-a-day line. Somebody will answer the phone and be able to answer their questions from the regulator perspective. You're required to post your first aid, who are the first aiders in your workplace, and contact information for them, where your first aid kits are located. Again, the things, if you think about the things that you want people to have quick, easy access to, that's generally the information you're going to put on your board. Or promotional things, if you wanted to promote something regarding health and safety, you've got a meeting coming up or something like that. That's another thing that would typically be posted on those boards. We're required to hold our safety committee meetings. The default value is monthly. If your committee decides otherwise, they just need to determine that in their rules of procedure, and they can meet at intervals at their discretion. Those meetings have to have documented minutes, and those minutes have to be posted again on that bulletin board or on that common network that people can access. Toolbox talks, another method of communication, or tailgate meetings, or morning huddles, or there's a million different names for it. But essentially, that's those little meetings that you do once a week. Some industries do them once a day, where we just kind of talk about, it's usually fairly informal. We talk about what's coming up today, what things people need to be aware of, stay on their toes about this, that, or the other thing. And they're short, sweet. We want to document who attended them and briefly what we talked about. It gives people a chance to get information firsthand, because again, we all know that just posting something on the board, it's very few guarantees that anybody's going to read it. Whereas if I force you into a meeting and we stand and talk about it, the likelihood of getting the information across is greater. So toolbox meetings, our toolbox talks are a great way, particularly if you've got something a little more critical you want to get across really quickly. Some do newsletters, monthly or semi-annual newsletters out around health and safety things. Now, these don't always have to be directly related to the workplace. There's nothing wrong with doing off the job safety tips too. So coming into the winter months, reminders about shoveling snow and proper use of shovels so people don't hurt their backs. Being aware of slip and fall hazards now because it's getting into icy season and things like that. These are all good positive messages and reminders to people to help prevent things. So with regards to training, there are some things that are specifically prescribed within the regulations that we must have people trained in. First aid being a good example. So we're required to have a certain number, depending on our occupancy and the number of people in our workplace. We're required to have a certain number of people that are trained in first aid, and the level of first aid, because there's three levels of first aid available. There's emergency first aid, which is your 1 day. There's standard first aid, which is your 2 day. And then there's emergency first responder, which is like a 5 or 6 day training course. Very few are required to have that, certain industries, certain circumstances, but in most cases, the emergency or the standard is what's needed. And again, the regulation outlines that in detail as to what exactly is required. That's a prescribed one. And the duration of that is prescribed. So they say it's good for X number of years. It's very, very clear. Working at heights is another one that's very clear. That one is prescribed by regulation. Thou shalt have fall protection training if working at heights, and it shall be refreshed every 3 years, and it shall include the following. Regulation is very, very clear. Sometimes, though, the regulation is not clear. So sometimes it comes back to that principle of due diligence that we talked about a little bit prior, in that some things you have to ask yourself, is this a job that has potential hazards that could cause harm? And what would be reasonable to expect people to be trained in? Is it reasonable to expect them to be trained in a particular thing, in using a tool, for instance, or doing a particular task? That's where it gets a little bit muddier and less clear. And you're not always going to find that things are specifically regulated, prescribed in regulation that you have to do training XYZ. So, you know, again, that's based around the hazards and what is a reasonable response to those things. So just because it's not prescribed does not mean you don't have to do training. You still should look hard at what you're doing and ask yourself, would it, if something was to happen involving this, would anybody look back and say, well, what kind of training did they get to do that particular role? And, you know, you need to be able to come up with answers for that. So other things would be, you know, the very fundamentals of people understanding their roles and responsibilities within the workplace. So we talked about the IRS, the Internal Responsibility System, at one of the other sessions. This is really important for people to understand that concept and understand what their roles and responsibilities are within our system. Again, they need to understand that. There's key pieces they need to understand. They need to understand those three fundamental rights that they're all provided under the Act. The right to refuse unsafe work, the right to know the hazards and that could meet them in their task that they're doing, and the right to participate in the right that we want them to come forward with identifying hazards, with incidents, let us know when incidents occur, all of those type of things. We need them to participate in those things as well. So them understanding that is very, very important. They also should know approximately what our policies and procedures are. So if we're required to have a safety program, I don't expect any employee to be able to memorize that and rattle it off to me line and verse exactly as it is in a 6-inch binder. No, that's not realistic. But I need them to know that there is a program, and I need them to know where they would go to find information on a particular thing, or if they identified a hazard, what would they do with it? Or if an incident was to occur tomorrow, who would I tell and what would happen when that incident be investigated? Who would investigate it, and so on? That's the kind of things I need them to understand. I need them to understand our various policies and procedures, not necessarily memorize them. I just need them to be familiar and be able to understand them. And these are important pieces in the training portion of that program. Again, safety committee or representative. Again, if you're 5 to 19, you'll have a representative. Minimum requirement. You can still have a committee, but the minimum is to have a single representative. The committee must be established and functioning. It's not good enough just to say we have a safety committee and never actually meet, never actually do anything. That will come back to bite you, I guarantee you. You need to have a functioning committee. Meetings need to be being held. They need to be documented. Recommendations that are made by the committee need to be documented and need to be closed out or addressed by management. Again, people should be able to know where to go to find out who their committee members are and who they would talk to if they had a question or concern. So again, this is an important part of the program, and an important part of our internal responsibility system is this principle of the safety committees and the representative. Hazards, of course, we need to be able to identify our hazards, which we talked about the other day. We need to be able to identify hazards, and we need to be able to manage the risk of those hazards. So putting controls in place to manage those risks. So ways we identify them is through inspections. So generally in a safety program, I would expect to see an inspection process or policy or procedure that says how often I do inspections, what kind of things I inspect, and so on. Investigations. So what do we investigate? When do we investigate? Who does those investigations? Hazard assessments, again, a system to make sure that we talked about doing our initial hazard assessment, looking at all the hazards in our workplace and assessing the risk, but then, going back once a year and reviewing that and making sure nothing's changed, because maybe we've changed some processes, maybe we've done some things differently. And again, going back to 2020, the marvel that was 2020, that changed for a lot of people, and hazards that we didn't have before. For instance, people working from home weren't there before. We didn't have that. That wasn't a hazard in our workplace. So that probably wasn't taken into account in our safety program because that wasn't something that we were doing prior. Observations, again, just those can be planned job observations where you're actually standing back and watching somebody do a task, and it's not a timed thing. It's not seeing if they're doing them within a certain amount of time or anything. You're standing back watching to see if we have a procedure, are they following that procedure? If they're not, why? Is it, maybe it's because the procedure's flawed, and quite often that's the case. We're looking for other hazards that maybe we weren't aware of in their job, that we didn't realize that they had to lift a 40-pound box down off a shelf that was 5 feet tall. Oh, okay, we never thought about that. We didn't realize that. That's an additional hazard that we need to take into account. Standing back and watching sometimes can be a very educational process. You can learn a lot from that. And finally, the evaluation of those controls. And we talked about this again the other day. We're putting controls in place. We need to take the time to actually look and see down the road, did those controls work in 6 months from now, or a year from now? How are things working? Are they getting better? Have they improved or not? And again, the old adage that what gets measured gets done. I'm a big fan of setting goals, but make sure when you're setting goals, you're setting realistic and achievable goals. The old SMART goals thing, specific, measurable, actionable, those things are very much apply. So make sure we're setting reasonable goals for ourselves, because if we're not setting any sort of goals, how do we know that we're being effective? So we're going to say we're going to do a monthly housekeeping inspection of our facilities. The question is, how many of those are getting done? And if we're not getting them done monthly, the question is why? Why are we not getting them done monthly? Because we've said in our program, we're going to do a monthly inspection. And as I alluded to in one of the earlier sessions, if it says in your program you're going to do a monthly inspection, that becomes the law. And a labor officer coming in is going to read that in your policy, and he or she is going to say, okay, I want to see 12 inspections for the last 12 months. So again, how do we establish those goals around those kind of things? So that could be, again, it could be inspections, it could be training, it could be reporting of hazards, reported of incidents, it could be the number of meetings we've held, toolbox meetings, JOSH committee meetings, safety committee meetings, how many assessments have we had, again, all of those type of things. So we could have some basic goals, say we want to, complete a monthly, the department needs to complete a monthly inspection. So that's a pretty easy one. We're looking for 12 of them at the end of the year. And you can establish accountability to these things. And accountability is not always a negative thing. People think of that as a negative thing, that if I don't meet the standard, I get beaten, or I get, something bad happens. But accountability is, in my personal opinion, is a good thing, because it reminds me that I need to get something done. So it's not about telling me at the end that I didn't complete it. It's around making sure that I get reminders to get it done, so that I can get it done effectively and measure that. So I need to know if one particular manager isn't getting his or her monthly inspections done. That's a question. It's maybe not their fault. Maybe they've got too many things on their plate. Maybe we need to delegate that to somebody else to get that completed. But if we say we're going to do it, we need to find a way of doing it. Maybe monthly is too frequent. Maybe it's redundant. Maybe that's too much. Maybe we need to do them every second month or every quarter. But again, if you don't establish some goals and look at those and hold people accountable to those, then things don't happen. Again, if I ask somebody to do something and I never follow up with them, I never hold them accountable, then they oftentimes, it won't get done. Sometimes it will, and then it'll start to slip off the table and other priorities will take over, and then all of a sudden it won't get done. And that's when inevitably the Department of Labor officer shows up to do an inspection and you're not compliant with your own standards. I think people can understand that, what I'm talking about. So the other way we measure and see how effective we are is by annually doing a little bit of an audit. So looking through our program and saying, okay, we said we're going to do monthly inspections. Are we doing monthly inspections? How many are getting done? How many are getting missed? What can we do to fix that? Those type of things. So an internal audit is something you're doing on yourself. So it's your own scorecard. Nobody knows about it outside of you. You do it yourself on yourself. It's a good tool. It's a good way to check and balance as management, particularly. It's a good way to know that we're on track, that things are going the way they're supposed to be. We do this kind of thing for other parts of our operations all the time. We just don't always do them around the safety part. And then, of course, there's always the option to do third-party audits. So to have somebody come in from outside and audit our facilities. Now, that has some definite advantages in that, it's an outside set of eyes. It's somebody else looking at it from a different perspective than maybe we do. Plus, they may or may not have some specific expertise around those kind of things. So I get asked quite commonly, Safety Services gets asked quite commonly to come in and do these kind of third-party audits for organizations to give them a snapshot from an outside set of eyes of how we're doing. I believe that these things are a positive experience. They should be a positive experience. I'm not there to beat up on people and tell them they're doing all these things they're doing wrong. That's not the way I believe audits should be done. I believe it should be a constructive process. The idea is to help you identify opportunities for improvement, not all the things that are wrong. So again, audits are another method of doing this, whether they're internal or external, of getting a picture of what goes on. So that's a little bit on the, how to look at yourself and say, what are we doing right? What do we need? Where do we need to improve? So I wanted to touch on the second part of the feedback came back around talking about what happens with the regulator. So Department of Labor, as I described before, the Department of Labor and Advanced Education has a occupational health and safety division. Within the division, they have enforcement officers that work in the field that are essentially the police for the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the associated regulations. The Act affords officers a quite broad-reaching powers within the workplace. They can enter the workplace at any reasonable time. So they can't make you open up at 3 o'clock in the morning. But if you're open and operating at 3 o'clock in the morning, they're well within the rights to show up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do an inspection. They can come in at any time, and again, reasonable time. They can take pictures, they can request documentation, they can seize things if they want. They can put stop work orders so they can shut down sections of your operation or entire operations. And actually, under the most recent revisions to the Act, they can get court orders to shut down operations associated with this that might have the same sort of hazards in other locations other than that individual location. So they have pretty broad-reaching powers. In fairness, they try, and the philosophy has changed a lot at the Department of Labor. They try to be fairly helpful in their approach. When they show up on the job site, they will commonly say, "We're here from the Department of Labor. My name is so-and-so. I'm here to conduct an inspection of your workplace." They will commonly ask for a representative from the safety committee or your representative to attend along with them. Again, that goes in that right to participate business. So it's trying to link another person to that, so somebody else hears the message that they're saying as they're going around, they're identifying things. One of the tools they use is this thing they refer to as the IRS checklist. And I will send people a link to that. Or basically, I guess I can't send you a link, but what I can do is I can explain some of the things that you would expect to see in that IRS checklist. So it goes through the aspects that of the internal responsibility system. So it looks for, do you have a program? Do you have a policy posted? Is the policy up to date? Is there a safety committee established? How many members on the safety committee? Does the safety committee have a rules of procedure? Is the safety committee meeting on the times that it's supposed to be meeting, and so on and so forth? Those are the kind of things they're looking for within that. Sorry, I apologize there. So they're looking for things like that. So they're asking, is the information posted that's required to be there? Are there procedures in place around the safety committee and around any work procedures that you have, and those type of things? So they have a checklist they go through. They refer to it as the IRLS checklist, but essentially it's going through the act from cover to cover and looking for opportunities or areas where you're not compliant with the rules. In which case they can issue warnings, they can issue orders, and they could potentially issue what they call administrative penalties, or APs. And we talked about those the other day. The idea of an administrative penalty is essentially a fine, a monetary fine for non-compliance with a particular portion of the regular act or regulations. So again, their focus is on the internal responsibility system though. It's our job, their job is to make sure we're following the rules and working within the internal responsibility system. Their oversight to that. They're looking at make sure we're doing that and enforcing that. So again, they're looking for those types of things within their inspection. The most common non-compliances, and they actually publish a document each year that shows the convictions under the OHS Act and regulations. And most common ones are the simple things. The most common orders are failing to have a policy and having it updated and properly posted, failing to have a safety program, failing to establish a safety committee. That's a really common one when they hit that 20 mark. Because again, 20 sneaks up on organizations really quickly when you take into account that what we refer to as regularly employed, so 4 weeks or greater, seasonal reoccurring employment. That sneaks up on you really quickly, and you can quickly fall over that 20 line and not realize it. So that's a common order that's written. Failing to provide adequate training, supervision, and so on. So that's another really common one. Again, sometimes that's the specifically prescribed training. Other times it's training that you ought to have known should have been done. So not necessarily specifically regulated. Because again, that general duty clause of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and many of these orders are written against that general duty clause, that failing to ensure the health and safety of persons at or near the workplace, and ensuring that employees, and particularly and providing information, instruction, training, and supervision that are necessary for health and safety. Those are two clauses that from the Act that are commonly charges are laid against, because again, they're open-ended enough that there's a lot of things fall within that. Failing to provide safe work practices and procedures, failing to use PPE, so people not using the proper PPE for the job that's required. And the other one, ironically, is failing to comply with an order. So when an OSH officer writes an order, they actually put a date on it. So they say, we need you to comply within 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. They put a date on it. And what happens is people don't. And that's a non-compliance, and that's an additional charge on top of if you don't comply by the set date. Now, if you ever have one of these and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to do this, but I need a little more time to get this done, contact the officer. They will commonly give you extensions. It's not unusual. They're reasonable people. They will give you extensions on these things and say, okay, how much time do you need? Well, I need an extra 3 weeks. Okay, we'll add 30 days onto it or something to give you some time. They will do that if they feel like you are actually trying. They're actually quite accommodating, and they will be quite helpful with that. But they need to put a date on it so that there's a specific time. So if you get stuck with this and you're not getting it done in time, contact the officer, throw yourself at their mercy, and say, look, I'm really sorry. We're going to get this done. I just need a little more time. Can you give me an extension of another 30 days or whatever it is? And in most cases, that's not an issue. So you have that option to go back to them. again, they try their best to be helpful, but essentially their job is still to enforce these laws. So if it's not compliant, they're going to tell you. They will not always give you an explanation of what you need to do to fix it, because again, that's not their job. Their job is to tell you what's broken, not to tell you necessarily how to fix it. So they will, and they don't want to get into a situation where they're consulting or giving advice. As a regulator, that's a dangerous waters from a legal perspective for them to be giving advice or direction. So they will just point you to the regulation, and saying you need to find a way to be compliant with that regulation. I hope that, I know that's kind of a bit of a whirlwind tour. If people do have any questions, please feel free to post those questions. I was going to say, I'll give you a few things here. So here is one document. So this is a small business checklist that comes right out of the Department of Labor. They published this some years ago, but it does give you a good idea of the type of things that they're looking for when they come in to do their inspections. This is the second thing I'm posting right now, is the prosecutions, the list of prosecutions from 2015 forward to 2020, and who they were, and what a summary of the offense, and what came of it, and it even has some of the sentencing charges on it. So to give you some perspective as to what things are happening out there, how companies are being charged, what kind of things they're not compliant with. And again, you will see a lot of them that list section 13 of the Act. They're A, C, D. That's that whole employer duties and precautions section of the OHS Act. Again, failure to ensure a person at or near the workplace, safety of persons at or near the workplace, maintaining equipment, providing training, information, instruction, supervision, and so on. That's where the majority of the orders and convictions do come from, because again, that's the most fundamental piece of our safety program, is making sure safety is making sure that those pieces are done. I'm just looking to see if there's any other questions here, and I'm not seeing any. Does anybody have any additional questions they would like to ask? Again, if you ever do and you come across something you're not sure about, my contact information is available there. You can contact me through the office. You can contact me through tie-ins. They can give you my contact information. I'm glad to try to help out. If it's a matter of just a 15-minute conversation to walk you through something or answer some questions and add some clarity to things, I'm glad to do that. That's not a billable thing. I'm glad to try to help out with that. I actually, we want people to be successful in this, and I think it's important that we work together to try to do this. Share resources with each other, how each other are doing things, and you can often find ways to manage these things quite well. It's not as overwhelming as it sounds. I always say it's one of those, take it step by step. Don't get overwhelmed by it. Take it step by step. Pick at something and work at it, and see if you can get something down. It's not, they don't have to be carved in stone. It just, you need to at least show that you're making the effort to do that. And like I say, look at it again in a year's time. And if it's not perfect, that's okay. It's better to be something and not perfect than than not do anything, than be frozen in your tracks. Anyways, I want to thank everybody. Thank you for coming out, and I hope people enjoyed this series. And please do provide feedback back to tie-ins if there's other topics or other things that might be of value to you down the road. And we'll see if we can put something together. And on that, I will pass it back to Nicole, and we'll close out the session. Thank you all.
On behalf of tie-ins and the Nova Scotia Tourism Human Resource Council, I'd like to thank our presenter, Joe, for your knowledge, and to all of our webinar attendees. We encourage everyone to complete the survey feedback form. The link's now available in the chat there. And a reminder also to indicate your interest in individual gap analysis sessions with Safety Services Nova Scotia. And you can do this within the webinar feedback survey and also arriving to your emails soon. Tie-ins is supporting operator costs for one-in-one COVID OHS assessments through our Tourism Reactivation of Industry program, also known as TRI. Thank you all again for attending our Health and Safety Certificate Series. Please email Lynn at tourism.ca with any questions you have about receiving your certificate of completion. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Bye.